Hello. Hello, and welcome. I'm Mehran Khalili. We're DiEM25, a radical political movement for Europe. And this is another live discussion featuring subversive ideas you won't hear anywhere else. And tonight we're looking at the EU's growing crackdown on pro-Palestinian voices. The context: Israel's genocide in Gaza continues. Just today, Israeli forces fired into a crowd of starving Palestinians at an aid distribution center, killing dozens, perhaps many more. But Israel has now also laid siege to the West Bank, and over the last few days, they've opened a new front by striking Iran, where my father is from, with reports of hundreds of deaths. So you might think that at a time like this, with war crime after war crime happening next door, the risk of regional war, and the prospect of waves of refugees, the European Union would be promoting a fierce public debate on Israel's actions. But instead, the EU is busy crushing dissent, particularly of pro-Palestinian voices, while supporting Israel to the max. Now, these crackdowns in Europe aren't anything new, and we've covered many of them here on DiEM-TV since October the 7th. Activists banned, events shut down, anti-Zionist Jews like Udi Raz and Iris Hefetz silenced, our own campaigner Melanie Schweitzer fired from her job, all for speaking out for Palestine. But the case you'll hear tonight shows how the European establishment is now taking its repression to a new level. In May, Brussels sanctioned one of its own citizens for doing journalism. He's Hüseyin Doğru, the founder of the media outlet Red, and the EU blacklisted him without a trial, without a hearing, because he covered pro-Palestinian protests in much the same way as many of us have been doing. This blacklist means that he's banned from travel, his bank accounts are frozen, he can't open a new one, and he's unable to provide for his family. Hussein has essentially become a non-person in his home country of Germany for the crime of doing journalism that the establishment didn't like. So tonight, we'll be looking closely at this case, which marks a dangerous escalation in Europe's assault on press freedom. We'll be mapping the tactics rolled out against Palestine solidarity and asking, crucially, how can we push back before this wicked machinery gets used on all of us? And who better to do this with than Hussein himself? Hello, Hussein. And we've also got, of course, our own Yanis Varoufakis, also incidentally banned by Germany from speaking at a pro-Palestine event last year. And of course, we've got you out there. If you've got thoughts, comments, rants, questions for Hussein or Yanis, please put them in the YouTube chat and we'll put them to our panel. Let's kick off with Yanis just to set the context. Yanis, what do you think is driving this crackdown, and why is it intensifying now?
Our regimes, with the German one first and foremost, are doubling down on barbarism. Remember Rosa Luxemburg posed from her cell the pertinent question of the 20th and the 21st, as it turns out, centuries: socialism or barbarism? And now they're absolutely determined they will go down the path of barbarism at full speed ahead. It is remarkable, isn't it? 2 or 3 weeks ago, maybe less, you could sense a change in the official version. Even Friedrich Merz, the new German Chancellor, and arch-Zionist Prime Minister Keir Starmer of the United Kingdom, they started referring to what Netanyahu is doing in Gaza as intolerable, unacceptable, and so on and so forth. So, there was a whiff in the air of a slight change. One would have expected that the gross violations of basic civil liberties in Germany, in Britain, in France, which were part and parcel of effectively supporting Israel's right to commit any genocide of its choosing, that would wane as the criticisms, unprecedented criticism after 2 years of genocide in Gaza and in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank and so on. One would have thought that what was happening on the ground of our European Union member states would reflect the change of scene. Well, it didn't. And I think Hussein's case is a brilliant illustration of that. Now, of course, since then, Netanyahu, the most dangerous terrorist on the planet, a man who, lest we forget, within 7 months, sorry, I'll say that again, within 20 months, started 7 wars, and you can count them. a separate one in Gaza, another one in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, now in Iran. Well, this clear and present danger to humanity responds to the criticism to my very criticism, considering the fact that he's an indicted war criminal by the International Criminal Court. He responded to this criticism by effectively launching an unprovoked attack on a member state of the United Nations, Iran. And how did Europe respond to this unprovoked attack on Iran? And by the way, saying that it was a preemptive strike is the definition of a war crime. In the United Nations Charter, it's very clear that preemptive wars are banned, as banned as any ban can ever expect to articulate. So, now he has them back in the palm of his hand, ridiculing them, effectively driving them, or dragging them, I should say, into yet another regime change process. We've seen how well they've gone in the past. And within Europe, you can see that the gross totalitarianism is proceeding at full speed. Because I'm very eager to hear Hussein speak, just for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, let me connect my case with Hussein's case, because in April of 2024, as Mehran said at the beginning, me and others, but primarily me, I was banned from entering Germany, participate in a congress that we organized with German Jew comrades who happened to be German Jewish, and some of them Israeli as well, because we dared have a conference on the theme, the very provocative theme, of a just peace in the Middle East. This was considered to be such a heinous crime that was banned from entering Germany. But they learned their lesson from that, the German authorities. Because my lawyer, German lawyer, and I filed a charge against the German authorities, as we had the opportunity to do, because as a citizen of the European Union, I was banned from entering Germany by the German authorities. So the German authorities still have an obligation, if they ban someone, if they try to turn someone into a non-person, as you said. Mehran.
Oh, you're back. Go on. We lost you for a second there, Yanis.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. You must have been pissing them off, so they've blocked you. Go on, try again. You mentioned non-person.
Yeah, so non-persons that are banned by member states, by governments, still maintain, under the pretense of the rule of law, the right to take them to court. So I've taken them to court. They don't like that. They try to postpone, they postpone again and again the court case. So they learned their lesson. And in the case of Hussein, as we are going to hear from him, they decided that it will not be the German authorities that render him a non-person. They will subcontract this to the European Union. And as far as I'm concerned, this is the first case I've ever heard of a German citizen who's been rendered, not by Germany, but by the European Union, a non-person. Why by the European Union? Utilizing a directive which was put in place in order essentially to sanction enemies of Ukraine, or people within the European Union that the European Union deemed to be a clear and present danger for the combined efforts of the European Union and NATO to defeat Russia, or to defend Ukraine from Russia. Let's not get into that. But this is remarkable that they bring together these two cases, Ukraine and Palestine, and they use this decree in order to subcontract to the European Union the banning and sanctioning of a European citizen, of a German citizen, so as not to give him the opportunity to take the German government to court. Essentially, what we have is the total dissolution, the annihilation, the cancelling of basic civil liberties across the European Union, where supposedly civil liberties were invented as part of modernity, the Enlightenment and then modernity. Now we have the opposite. We have opacity, we have the violation of basic European rights by the European Union on behalf of member states that want to deny us, in this case Hussein, the opportunity to take them to court. I'm very much looking forward to hearing the story in all its grim detail from Hüseyin Doğru.
Hussein, welcome. Please walk us through what happened to you.
Hello, thank you for having me on your show and sharing with me your platform to explain what is happening today in Europe. The first question kind of was in Yanis's speech, or your introduction as well, Mehran. Why is that happening right now? Before we dive in, kind of why it happened to me, but why is it in general happening that EU is right now cracking down on dissent voices? Germany's cracking down on dissent voices, and why the media also plays such a big role. And one of the biggest examples of that was in Germany, as Yanis also explained and highlighted, the Palestine Congress, which was a very unique case where academics, politicians, journalists, activists around the world were invited, and they were stripped of their basic rights, and people outside of that event were arrested or attacked, even inside. The police stormed it, which was unthinkable for most of the liberals in Europe to happen 10 years ago, but which is also today supported by that specific group as well, by liberals, by from social democrats to green parties, everyone today. I think what happened in that specific case, the change in Europe and the very hardcore crackdown, is that Europe, and in my case, Germany right now, is on purpose cracking down right now on the most marginalized group within the society, which is in Europe and Germany, Palestinians, because Palestinians are Jews haters, they're terrorists, they're Hamas, they're PFLP, they're no individual beings who have basic rights, because the moment you frame them as such, they don't have any rights. And the second one is the Muslims, the Muslim population, citizens in Europe, because it is the most acceptable to crack on these parts of societies, because since the so-called war on terror started by the US after 9/11, there is this image of Middle East Muslim is undemocratic, they're against our values, and everyone else who's fighting that is fighting for our values. So that was very much acceptable for the whole society in Europe to crack down on these population. But what people do not understand, each of these journalists, each of these trade unions, NGOs, politicians, and normal citizens who are supporting that crackdown, this is technically a crackdown on their rights right now. Because today Europe is maybe using their baton, the police is using their baton and smashing it on the faces and heads of Palestinian activists, Palestinians, Muslims. But it is technically a message to all European citizens. In that case, Europe, I'm going to expand. I'm preparing for war. I'm preparing for crackdown in case you dare to criticize me in the future. This is what is going to happen as well. So I think that needs to be read like that, because by focusing all these marginalized people, they're also at the same time distracting from everything else right now, which is cut off social welfare, a rise of unemployment, social insecurities. And in all this context, they're shutting down every single voice, which ended up with me being shut down as well, who was reporting on these issues, who was reporting with my media outlet, Red, reporting on the crackdown on pro-Palestinian movements, on the event where also Yanis was invited, was shut down from inside, where our cameras was taken away, internet was shut down. And I think this is unique, as Yanis at the beginning said, with my case, because for the first time ever, Europe sanctioned a journalist in context of the Russian sanction packages and laws and regulations, who was criticizing Russian policies publicly, which I did, who was criticizing the war in Ukraine, by justifying that for doing or covering protests across Europe, which meant for the European Union that covering protests, covering violent protests, means for the European Union that only Russia can benefit from that, because I'm creating social discord, I'm focusing on that, apparently, and Russia can benefit from that. Therefore, that makes me a Russian news outlet or pro-Russian journalist, which is, I can see, Mehran, you're rolling your eyes. This is exactly what happened to me as well. Like when we read.
Well, I just wanted to drill down on that one point, because what you just said, and to clarify, by covering any protest, the argument from the EU is that somehow you're fomenting anti-EU, pro-Russian narratives by covering any protest, and not necessarily a protest in favor of Russia or anything like that. I mean, we're talking about the pro-Palestinian protest you were covering. Can you just explain that logic, if there is a logic?
Yeah, that's the 1 million euro question. I think there is no logic, but for them there is a logic. I think to be able to understand all of that, we need to kind of roll back a bit. How did we came to this point? It's going to be a little bit technical, like using a bit technical words, but I think for the audience it is very, very important, because that did not just happen from nowhere. It technically started with the annexation of Crimea by Russia. So that's when the European Union created the European External Action Service, EEAS, which was tasked to combat disinformation and any combating technically Russian influence in Europe. After that, around 2018, that body was extended with more rights, which created kind of like an action plan against disinformation. And then we first heard like these words, and I mean, I think everyone knows that now. It's like undermining European democracy, the European values, the European project, and about strategic threats. And at some point, disinformation, and that turned around 2020 into hybrid threat. And that word was kind of created by the EU as well. And what does that mean, from disinformation to hybrid threat? That means technically information is now categorized by the EU as a threat, as long as it does not serve their benefits. In that case, as long as a journalist does not report on behalf or for the benefit of the European Union. That might be a protest. That might be, if I criticize in context of the Ukraine war, Russia and Europe, for example. So it's kind of militarizing and criminalizing information. And by fighting disinformation and shutting down information, the EU started to use disinformation. Because disinformation does not only mean to spread wrong information, disinformation also means the cutting or shutting down the other side of the event, the other side of certain debates. So what happened after that is also like the EAS created or introduced the FIMA, I think it is called, the Foreign Information Manipulation and Interference. This was very, very unique and very, very important, because That gives the EEAS the right to punish, sanction everyone who is also, how should I word that now? Involved in, this is very important, non-illegal suspicious behavior. So they say, you have maybe a suspicious behavior and it is not illegal, but we judge that as a threat to us, we can't punish you. That's what the FIMA says. So this is very important.
There's a link in the chat just for you watching out there to this. This is the EEAS's FIMI report, which has a list of alleged, quote, foreign interference actors without any evidence. And your name appears on that list. So go on.
So that body is created, these rules for them or guidelines, however they call that now, are in place. And then around 2022, they started to label or blacklist journalists, TV channels who are working also in Europe, like RT, like TRT, like CCTV, like, and I think there is the link also to Iran today, bombing of the state TV, press TV. They blacklisted them and did them as no real media in Europe. They just decided that. Evidence, no evidence. The only evidence is look at EEAS, look at FIMA. That's the template for that. And they use that now to create, like also in 2022, and that's the last point, the Digital Service Act. The Digital Service Act says that in a state of emergency, whatever that is, they don't announce that or explain that they technically can sanction, punish, or whatever punishment they have in their mind, journalists and information. And this now all applied to me the first time in form of a sanction, but the German government did not do it directly with me. They, as Yanis said, passed it over to the European Union, because in Germany, they could not do that by legal means, on a legal way, because the backlash, there is still this, in a bourgeois democracy, the little backlash if it comes to their own citizens, which I am, even though they don't maybe accept me as such. But if a journalist is on court here, he has a lot of rights. But if you transfer it to the European Union, the European Commission, there is no judge, there is no hearing, there is no evidence. It's an extrajudicial act of, and the EU says sanctions are not punishment. They are punitive to change your behavior for the benefit of the European Union. Is not a punishment. So extrajudicial execution of a journalist. But now coming back to the beginning, I think, why is that happening? They all lay that out and they testing that with me the first time. And that's what makes the whole situation unique, is the first time. If they can go away with that, this is going to soon happen to you guys as well, or even those who attacked us.
Well, thank you for that explanation, Hussein. I know for you out there, it got a little technical, but I think it's very important for activists, organizers, potential targets of this new machinery, as I put it, to be aware of all the ins and outs of it, to understand how it works and the pretext that they're using to clamp down on narratives they dislike. If I can ask you though, Hussein, while you've got the floor, just to move to the sanction part and explain actually what it means to you personally to be blacklisted in practice.
Just a correction, blacklisted and sanctions are two different things here. Okay. Blacklist is like you're on a list, we don't like you and whatsoever, but you still have your rights. But being sanctioned means, a lot of people understand under sanction, your bank accounts are frozen and you're not allowed to travel. That's the easy part. I'm not allowed to pay my lawyer. I'm not allowed to buy water. I'm not allowed to provide my child with food. I'm not allowed to work. I'm not allowed to buy medicine. Every single monetary transaction with me is forbidden. Technically, you're not even allowed to give me a basket of food because I could turn that technically into money. And this is forbidden. And if I violate, or you, I don't know about you, but if I would violate one of these things, I could face like 5 years of prison time by avoiding or yeah, sanctions technically. But they went further. I'm sanctioned, I'm on that list, but they also technically sanctioned my wife and our unborn twins. How? Because they froze all the accounts. She's not allowed to receive her salary right now. So in this moment, we technically have no money to that we can access to go and buy something. In reverse, there is also the problem because a lot of activists, journalists, colleagues, politicians, and family members even said, should we send you money? We said, don't do that. Like, don't do that because you would be maybe categorized as avoiding sanctions. And this is the problem here. Like, sanction is, as the European Union describes on their website, a tool which is aligned with humanitarian law, which is not deemed to punish, but rather to change your behavior. I mean, the humanitarian aspect, we can debate on that if they want, but for me, that looks completely different. To change behavior, what kind of behavior do they want to change? My behavior to use my rights as a citizen of Europe or of world to express my opinion on certain events. Also the rights kind of to survive because all my existential grounds are taken away from me. I'm
Well,
like, to be a bit more specific, maybe that sounds a bit crude, but just to make the point that I don't want anyone to misunderstand me, someone in a prison has technically right now more rights than I have because they can, in custody, buy something which I can't even because I need for everything maybe a permission, maybe not. If they allow it or not, I don't know.
Well, I hope for people watching and listening that you guys understand what Hussein has just said. It's quite dramatic. The treatment that he's getting definitely represents a ratcheting up of repression. Just to close the circle on what happened to you there, Hussein, I mean, you've said a few times that the goal of these sanctions, and to clarify, it's that sanctions, not being blacklisted, is to get you to change your behavior. So presumably what? How long have they given you to change your behavior? I mean, let's say you play by their rules. What do they? Is there a review in 6 months where they deem that you're able to be reintegrated back into society? Clarify this for us, please.
I don't know the answer for that because like sanctions also work like that. You get sanctions, you don't get any, like they don't inform you. You have to contact them. So it is up, you have the responsibility to check if you're sanctioned or not. And what does that mean for you? So once my lawyer wrote them, at some point they wrote back and said, okay, according to the paragraph whatsoever, Mr. Doğru is sanctioned. And can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. According to these decisions, Mr. Doğru is sanctioned. And at the same time, you have the responsibility to read through a lot of things and find out what you can do or not, how long that takes you. So what we are trying to do now, we have got two information. We can appeal that decision, which we will do, and then sue at the European courts, the Commission technically, to revoke that decision. But how long that takes, that's completely up to the European Commission.
Okay, thank you. Yanis, if I can bring you back in. I'm still quite stunned by everything I've heard, to be honest. So these sanctions are protective, not punitive, apparently. What is this, if not punishment without trial?
It's extrajudicial cancellation, punishment, sanction of a person that has fallen foul of the authorities' ideology. It's really nothing less, nothing more than that. Now, allow me to go 10 years back when I was involved in negotiating with the German government, with the European Commission, with the European Central Bank on behalf of the majority of the Greek people who had given us a mandate. It's now exactly 10 years ago. Now, back then, they were more subtle. They clearly removed any democratic rights that the people of Greece had. They overturned the referendum. They used methods of financial terrorism, the same way that they shut down Hussein's bank account. They shut down every single bank in Greece, simply and callously and cynically, in order to blackmail the Greek population in the referendum that was upcoming to vote in favor of the European Commission's point of view. So brutality and cynicism and gross violation of the spirit of democracy, of human rights, of political rights, this is not new. But what is it? And we need to emphasize this. I'm very glad we have Hussein here, because this innovation by the German government on the one hand, and of course the European Commission on the other, is a vile and dangerous precedent, as Hussein said. Because today they choose to use anti-Russian or Russian-related decrees in order to stop a journalist, German citizen, from writing about Palestine. Tomorrow, they can do exactly the same thing regarding any issue, any topic that they do not want people to talk about. It could be anything from the investigation of an accident, a railway accident, an airplane crash. Once we have allowed them to use extrajudicial cancellation methods of European citizens, then that is the thin edge of the wedge. And we go back to the period before Magna Carta. Go before Magna Carta. We're not talking about democracy now, liberalism. We're going, no, we are digging ourselves into a hole, a wormhole that brings us out like a time machine before the time of Magna Carta. But allow me, Mehran and Hussein, to answer a question in the chat by somebody who asked, I was reading it as Hussein was speaking. Now, why is the European and the German establishment so gung-ho about shielding Israel from criticism? Because this is what we have here. We have the weaponization of anti-Russian laws, decrees, in order to stop Hussein, us, whoever, from demanding that Israel is taken to task for the genocide, or ethnic cleansing, and so on. And I think it is important in the context of both Germany and Greece and the whole of Europe to say a few words on this. I'm going to put forward 4 answers to your question, whatever it is that you asked. Why is Israel so much shielded from criticism for obvious violations of basic human rights, even European values? The first one has to do with the genocide tradition of Europe, which Europe does not want to discuss, and which Israeli Zionists are very clearly threatening European rulers, the European ruling class, with mentioning it, if they do not receive enough support from the European ruling classes. What do I mean by that? From the perspective of the Zionists, the genocidal Zionists, they're not doing anything different to what Europeans did in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in Kenya, in South Africa, which is to look at the land that they wanted to declare it terra nullius and to say that this is a land without people, because the people there are humanoids, they're not classified as human beings. This is the first step towards genocide. So, the Zionists say, well, but what have we done differently to what the Australians did, for instance, what the British did in Australia? So there is this tradition of genocide that Europe has never really acknowledged. Never, never. I will remind you, dear listeners and viewers, that Winston Churchill, after the Second World War, after the Holocaust, after the Geneva Convention, after the establishment of the United Nations, the Bill of Rights, and so on and so forth, Winston Churchill came out and said, I would never apologize for what our settlers did in Australia, in Africa, and in we brought civilization. This is how settlers in the West Bank think. They think that this is a land which is empty of people because the Palestinians don't have people. So there is a very close relationship between the ideology of European superiority, European white supremacy, and Zionism. They are exactly the same thing. I mean, Zionism came out of European white settlers. That's the first reason. The second reason is that you can see our leaders now. You saw what happened at G7 yesterday. They were all taken up a mountain in Canada, God-forsaken place. And they were supposed to sit around the table with Greg Donald, man with the orange hair, and have a discussion about how to save the world, and strike a deal on tariffs and trade and all that. And Donald Trump ignored them completely and got in the airplane and left. And now they're stuck up there. I don't know where they've left so far. So for them, the people like Friedrich Merz, Chancellor of Germany, for whom Atlanticism, subservience to the United States, being part of the same team as the United States, is part and parcel of his makeup, his existence. He cannot conceptualize himself differently. He needs to save Atlanticism from a president, Trump, who doesn't care about Atlantis. He just wants to move on. He wants to leave the Europeans behind. He treats the Europeans as vermin, the same way, more or less, as the Israelis treat the Palestinians. And because in the United broken rule that America supports Israel's ethnic cleansing, come what may. Any criticism, like the mild, puny criticism that Macron occasionally comes up with Israel, is considered by Atlanticists like Merz as a threat to any hope he has of maintaining Atlanticism. The third reason is German specific. I've been doing some reading recently, and it struck me that during the Adenauer administration, first proper government of Western Germany after the Second World War, the logic for espousing Zionism was really startling and eerie. If you read the speeches and the texts regarding the attitude of the Federal Republic towards Israel, it is very clear, and I can cite texts and speeches and articles and books, that the Adenauer government adopted the line that in order for Germany to become rehabilitated and to be readmitted to the League of Nations, to civilized world again after the Holocaust and the Second World War, they need to go along with the Zionist lobby in New York. It's really very clear. What they're saying is that we have to win them over, otherwise we do not gain entry into the League of Respectable Nations. This is, I'm going to say something controversial, but something which I think is absolutely spot on. Otherwise, I wouldn't take the risk of saying it. This is an extension of Hitler's logic. Hitler's logic was that the threat to Germany came from American Jews. It's not very far to go from that to the view that now we've lost the war, the Germans have lost the war, we need to appease the German Jews. It's very close for comfort. And the result is that successive German governments have, realizing that capitalism requires nationalism, an authoritarian nationalism, as the glue and the cement that brings together, keeps together in a corporate sense, the social classes which are at war with one another under capitalism in an inevitable class war. But the way to contain the class war and to maintain this figment of national unity usually comes in the form of authoritarian nationalism. But in the case of Germany, authoritarian nationalism was discredited by the Holocaust. It was discredited by the Second World War. So it seems to me that they substituted authoritarian nationalism for Zionism. Zionism became the glue of the political system, of the social system in Germany. And to finish off, in the case of countries like Greece, I think Greece is a very good example because Greece was pro-Palestinian until very recently, until 2009, 2010. When I say Greece, I mean every government, including very right-wing governments. Greece did not recognize Israel, I think, until the early 1990s. Even the right-wing governments, they didn't recognize Israel until the Palestinian state was also recognized. So this country that has this long tradition. Now, if you look at the governments of the last 10, 15 years, in the midst of the worst crisis that rendered Greece financially, economically, and socially non-viable, still is not doing that. The powers that be, whoever happened to be in government, Social Democrats, Christian, the equivalent of the German Christian Democrats, the democracy people, including my party after the capitulation, after I left the government, they had to win the trust of the international establishment by espousing them. And so it's not a question of whether it's not that they become Zionists, but they had to pay their dues in the same way that any country that enters the European Union must enter NATO first. Have you seen that? Have you noticed that? There hasn't been a single country that entered NATO, that entered the European Union without entering NATO first, except Austria, but that's because of an arrangement with the Soviet Union back then. Similarly, you have to espouse Zionism in order to become accepted in the communities of power. That's my long answer to why there is this concerted attempt to silence people like Hussein.
And if I understand correctly, to become a German citizen now, you also need to swear some kind of allegiance to Zionism. Israel or to Zionism, basically. So absolutely right. Let me just dip into the chat for a couple of comments and questions from you guys out there. Michael says, Hussein speaks the truth. This is McCarthyism in a newer form. Rudston calls it Orwell on steroids. Nicola Curtin says, I know they're being tough, but I can't believe what's happening to Hussein. Why is there not civil disobedience? Why are we not rising up against this in numbers? I just don't understand why people are allowing this to happen. Jay Adnes says that as an EU citizen, I feel so unheard by the EU when it comes to real life problems, housing, unemployment, cost of living. And Chris says quite plainly, the fascists won. It's either become a revolutionary or leave. I hear Southeast Asia is nice. Hussein, you've talked about, I mean, there's a piece on our site, dm25.org, you've written, published it yesterday, where you describe how this playbook can be used against any kind of activism that's deemed anti-EU, unions, climate activists, etc. So you've elaborated a little bit on this already, but what kinds of legal grassroots avenues can be used to fight these kinds of measures?
I think what is very important to be able as grassroots movements, but also as media representatives to fight that is fight and challenge what the EU or the governments right now within the EU, but it's technically also a template across the world. All capitalist, imperialist countries do that. But in that case, we're talking now about Europe. What they're trying to do to distract from the real problems in Europe that we have, which I kind of try to explain a little bit, is like unemployment, cut of social welfare. In Berlin is like impossible for someone who's earning like 1,500 euros in a month to pay his rent. Like these situations, these topics are the most important topics that we have currently. Is not what is happening in China, what is happening in Iran, or what is happening in Russia for us. Obviously, they're affecting our lives because we're living in a world which is interconnected. But our primarily thing for activists and journalists should be, we need to focus on these things. We need to focus what is really hurting people in their daily life. We need to focus on mass strikes. We need to focus on civil disobedience. We need to focus on exposing how the shift from these problems is taken by the governments is shifted to somewhere else. I mean, we're talking about Israel and Netanyahu, why he's going into a war with Iran right now to distract from his own problems in occupied Palestine, which is controlled by him and his politicians, to avoid the anger of the society there. I mean, before the Gaza war, we saw that we had this whole democracy movement in the occupied territories by Israelis. And that was a big danger for Netanyahu. That was a big danger for that system that they established. So they needed to start something to distract from that. They needed to go all out war and a genocide. The same thing is happening also in Europe. And I think this is the main focus because this is also why journalists are silenced here. It's not only me who is silenced. I'm the most extreme examples, but there are a lot of people who are being cancelled. There are a lot of people who lost their jobs in Germany, across Europe as well. I have a colleague in Paris, Shahin Hazami, who was arrested because he reported from Lebanon for terrorism charges, but also who reported about institutional racism here. And I think this is something what we need to focus. And a lot of people ask me also always like, what are we doing right or wrong? What do we need to do to help Palestine? And I think there is this old, I think it was Ernst Thälmann or Karl Liebknecht, don't nail me on that now, who said, the main enemy is in our country. It is the German imperialism that we need to fight to be able to help other struggles across the world. I think this is where the grassroots movement needs to come in and needs to focus on, because Yanis tried to explain like why is Europe shielding also Israel in their war. I think just to make to add something on that, I think they're not just shielding them; they are actively there in a war. This is, I think, for me, two different things because having Israel there waging their wars for them by supporting them, sending them the weapon. They don't, war is not always pulling the trigger on a field. War is also being active in a war is also supporting it in terms of cracking down the voices here, supporting it by delivering weapons, but also supporting it politically, justifying it with disinformation. I think that is something we need to focus here, the German imperialism, the European imperialism, because we are right now here to be able to change something and fight that.
Thank you for that, Hussein. Yanis, anything you'd like to add to that? Any reflections?
No, I'm totally covered by what Hussein had to say, but I need to ask Hussein, because I know what the propaganda against Red, Roth, and him has been, to clarify some accusations, excuses, they're extremely poor excuses that have been given for his being sanctioned, along the lines that he and Red were funded by Russia. This is the usual smear that is meant to excuse all sorts of crimes. But I think it's important to tackle it at its root and to have a very clear analysis that we share with our audience on this charge and the reasons why we think that, well, we consider them to be absolutely toxic distortions of the truth, the kind of distortions that Joseph Goebbels would have been extremely proud of.
Hussein?
Yeah, we are accused also in the sanctions package of having deeply ties with Russian media, Russian whatsoever, structural financial ties with Russian media outlets and disinformation or state. Where does that come from? I mean, first of all, no, we don't have, but where does that come from to understand why it's also stupid? So against us, there has been a campaign since after October 7, since we started to cover the protests in Germany, especially. And at some point, German news outlets called Tagesspiegel published an article by saying, does Moscow deliver something alongside like, does Moscow backed outlet deliver or produce these videos from protests in Berlin, or where do they come from? So what they did is throwing out accusation, idea of something without really saying it is Russian. They said, yeah, Red Media is founded by Hüseyin Doğru. Hüseyin Doğru worked in the past for Red Fish, which was what they said as well, which is true, funded by a Russian news agency called Rupli, which we never hid, by the way. It was on our website. So for them, it was okay, you work there. Now you have your own thing. That's the first indication to be Russian. And the second thing was also for them that, as I elaborated a little bit, that my coverage is fueling into disinformation and social discord, which only Russia can benefit from that. So these are the two evidences that they give now. So these accusations of Hüseyin Doğru was at Red Fish, now he has Red Media, so it must be maybe Russian, was at some point, it was pushed so much in the media that at some point Antony Blinken, I think it was last year, September, in a press statement talked about that as well and said, Red Media is a Russian cooperation, etc., etc. But he said something very important as well. He said, according to Tagesspiegel. But Tagesspiegel himself said, it is maybe like that because this guy worked there, now he's working here. But by a political person, one of the most powerful person in the world, referring to an article, which was an allegation, repeating it, it became a fact now. For the same news outlet to say, Red Media is Russian because Blinken said so. But what they don't say, he's referring to their allegations. But no evidence was given. So this is the case how they build around us. And it was, I must say, very smart of them. Because they create the echo chamber right now by repeating, as Yanis also said, referring to Goebbels. I think it was Goebbels who said, repeat a lie as enough, it becomes a fact. And this is technically what happened. By the way, just a fun fact, one of the news outlets who was having an extreme hatred towards our coverage of pro-Palestinian protests was the newspaper called Taz, which claims to be left, who are extremely pro-Israeli, pro-Zionist, and even in some articles justified, it was the article of Nicholas Potter, almost justifying the killing of more than 170 journalists. They might be maybe legitimate targets. This outlet smeared us as well with, he worked there at Redfish, so he might maybe Russian, but what they don't say, one of their director of their foundation of Taz is a former Rupli employee. Also a Russian company. So does that mean they're Russian now as well? With their very basic logic, which they apply to us, they must be now Russian asset as well. Because their foundation, which is responsible for the whole financial, not the whole, but the majority of the financial income, the person who's responsible for that is a former Rupli RT employee. So does that make them Russian? And the other thing was like state affiliated with us always. I mean, the majority of the German outlets, newspapers gets state funding. So does that make someone state's propaganda tool? Is that the case? And this is kind of what they try to build. And in that context, it was never about facts. It was about repeat something as much as possible, put the Russian label on it. That works right now. I think people forget what that means in Germany when the war against Ukraine started. Doctors, shops did not allow Russians to come in to be treated. They forgot that, and when today people do that, which I think is completely wrong, that's a different thing. But which was not kind of condemned back then, and now today people doing that with, I don't like Zionists to come into my shop. That's then racism, like in this atmosphere. It is easy to make people believe you're Russian. Tomorrow, maybe I'm Hamas, and the next day, which they do, prepare their war with China because they're going into that direction, and maybe I'm Chinese then for them. I don't know. But no, just to make clear, we are not Russian. We are not Russian state funded or whatsoever. In contrary, we always, from the very beginning, criticized Russia as well, as we see Russia as imperialist country, or I personally as well, which is for me not different than the other side, which is NATO, EU, and whatsoever. And as I think as a communist, as a socialist, how could I support these policies and imperialistic policies around the world?
Thank you for that, Hussein. Very clear. And the context, of course, Europe openly militarizing this kind of pretext is that they'll be, I fear, reaching for it quite a bit in the future. As we kind of get to the end of our hour, go on, Yanis. Sorry if you had something else you want to add. Go on.
Mehran, thank you. Look, the European Union, through banning and sanctioning Hussein, through banning people like me, our comrades in Berlin and so on, they are weaponizing the George W. Bush doctrine that if you're not with us, you're against us. It is important, comrades, that we do not fall in that trap and we do not reverse that. So this is why DiEM25 makes a point of being nuanced. For instance, the case of Iran, we have supported steadfastly the demonstrations against the Iranian regime, the woman life freedom movement for emancipating women and men from the theocratic regime. But at the same time, we are not going to allow, in our name, an imperialist incursion that attacks Iran, this regime, from outside. As Chakraborty Spivak once said, it is ludicrous, the famous feminist, it is ludicrous for liberal feminists in the United States, in Europe, to believe that white supremacist soldiers with the American insignia or the British insignia are going to save brown women from brown men by bombing them. Similarly with the situation in Palestine. If this was 1938 and this was the morning after Kristallnacht, we would only have one imperative, one duty, to defend Jewish life from the Nazis. Today, we have one imperative, along with our Jewish comrades, to defend Palestinians from the Zionist menace. This is what DiEM25 is about. We are not going to be lured into the logic by George W. Bush. If you're not with us, you're against us.
Thank you for that, Yanis. Well put. And Hussein, a last question for you. Somebody out there is watching and they've listened to your story and they would love to speak out for Palestine or for any of these other causes that we've mentioned could be the target of this playbook. And now they're thinking, oh, no, I don't want what happened to Hussein to happen to me. What would you say to them?
speak up. Do it. Because the moment we don't talk, this is the moment they have won. The fact that they're attacking us, me, others around the world, means they're losing and they're not winning. I'm just looking at my colleagues in Gaza, which I have on a daily basis contact with, where I was as well. They're getting bombed every single day, and they keep the microphone, they keep their voices up, they keep publishing, they keep demonstrating. I think it was the last show that you guys had with Mohammed Al-Qurt, where Mohammed said there was this topic about does protests bring something, and he was like, kind of yes and no, but I think it does a lot. We should all remember when in the first days after October 7, how the German police was beating up every single person who dared to speak up, just to say, stop the war. And today, there are tens of thousands of people on the street because they did not stop and allow them to be silenced. I think this is the only way. We need to keep fighting with the means that we have as journalists, as activists, and we should not allow anyone to silence us and scare us. It is scary, yes, but keep in mind that those who are going on the street, who want to go on the street and who are afraid, you are not alone. And we are a whole movement, and the tide is turning, and this is good.
Thank you, Hussein, and lovely note to end on, and all the best to you with this difficult situation. And thank you to you, to Yanis, to you guys out there for your comments, questions, for watching. If you would like to join DiEM25 and meet this kind of repression head on, then go to diem25.org/join if you would like to support us. We have no big backers. It's all small donors from across the world. Then please go to diem25.org/support. Take care.